Today I'm going to be reviewing Diana's speech on positive effects on prostitution. She gave 3 secondary claims to back up her major claim, which were protection of workers and customers, respect and freedom of choice, and prostitution as a career path through business. For the protection of workers and customers, she defended regulation of required checkups. And for the respect of choice, she defended the right to choose a desired career path. And last was being able to tax prostitution. In my refutation speech, I'm going to oppose why legalizing prostitution will give a negative effect on society. The points I'm going to discuss on why legalizing prostitution will negatively affect society are: taxing will bring little to no revenue, the human trafficking it will cause, and psychological effects on prostitution. For my first point on how taxing will bring little to no revenue comes from Donna Hughes, who describes how Germany is doing with their legalization of prostitution. Donna Hughes, a professor at the University of Rhode Island, reported that German lawmakers thought they were going to make hundreds of millions of euros in tax revenue when they legalized prostitution in 2002. But Germany suffered a big deficit and estimated that the government lost over 2 billion in euros each year. So that would be terrible. And with the economic downfall that the United States are suffering from, legalizing prostitution would add to a bigger deficit, which would negatively affect society. For my second point on human trafficking comes from Melissa Farley, Executive Director of Prostitution Research and Education, reported that out of 2.5 million people being trafficked around the world, 80% are women and 80% are women and children. So prohibition would give cover to traffickers. It would allow the use. It would allow them to use the laws against prohibition to intimidate women and especially children. As we know, prostitution is often described as a victimless crime or consensual crime because no one present at the crime is unwilling. But in reality, prostitution is a violation of a human's most basic right, and is being violated when abusing or attacking a human's dignity and worth. So human trafficking is part of the First Amendment, so you can't do that, obviously. And for my third point and final point, I'm going to discuss the psychological effects on prostitution. Experts, government reports, and academic publications are increasingly confirming that legalization of prostitution does not reduce stigma, does not eliminate violence, and fails to make things safer in prostitution. In an interview by Lauren Hirsch from CNN, she interviewed a prostitution survivor who, I'm sorry. It sounds so bad. A prostitution survivor who emphasized that stigma originates on the demand side and the secrecy demanded by buyers to conceal the harm they cause, and creates devastating form of stigma. This leads to post-traumatic stress, which then affects the mental health and causes severe problems later in life for the person. And the emotional health consequences of prostitution include severe trauma, stress, depression, anxiety, and self-medication through alcohol and drug abuse. In a poll taken in the Minneapolis-St. Paul study, 46% of the women attempted suicide, and 19 tried to harm themselves physically in other ways. And with that said, prostitution hurts society more than it helps, because it will create little to no tax revenue and the psychological effects it causes to women. And that is all.
Great.
Oh, yeah. Pigtails everywhere. She's our nail.
we went tanning at my salon. It was the best. We watched Zoolander.
Oh, I love that.
It was on TV, that's why.
Yeah.
Are there any extra papers assigned by way?
Let me see. Did anybody,
Alright, which Christina is which Christina? What's your last
Lee and Chemist,
Shamus.
Shamus.
I didn't catch you.
Shamus, okay. Did we pass out all of the prompts? Are there any extras out there?
There's actually some people who didn't get any.
Some people who didn't get any, huh?
They're like this whole left side.
That's a little odd.
Side knows I remember.
Mathematically, that shouldn't work, you know? Because we had 6 the other day and everybody else, but maybe there's a reason.
The classes are here.
We have people are lollygagging in, so that does happen.
Lollygagging.
All right, Robert. You lay out the main and secondary claims of the advocate, and then you pretty much ignore them. Your first argument addresses the advocate's third point. So there's a little bit of overlap there, which is really talking about whether or not there would be revenues and some economic benefit from doing that. So there is an application there, but the sequence in which you put it together is not very direct. But I can see that there's an application there. You need to make that organization work a little bit better for you. If you're going to ignore the other points, then just say, look, I'm going to respond to these points in the general arguments about problems with prostitution, but let's talk specifically about this so-called economic benefit that we're going to have. And let me start with this particular point here about this. So when we're following the arguments, we know exactly which argument you're applying it to. One of the reasons that we do this assignment is to get you ready for the debates, because you need to be able to organize your ideas well. The debate's going on, and everybody who's listening needs to be able to follow the arguments. And if you don't follow an organizational structure, it's going to be a mess, because it'll just be random information and people will just throw it together the best they can. Instead of you're making the argument, then you're having the audience make the argument in their head based on the information you provide them. You want to be the advocate of your own claims. I thought that the other 2 arguments that you developed, look, I thought you had good evidence on all of the points that you developed. I thought that was really solid, so your research on those points is good. Like I said, there's no refutation of the evidence that the advocate presents. It's just I've got these other counterclaims, and the counterclaims are not really specific to the points that the advocate brought up. The trafficking issue, for instance, I think you developed that pretty well, showing that there's potential cover that's created by eliminating the prohibition against prostitution, and that it could then be exploited even worse, and we can have all these harmful outcomes as a consequence. I thought that was pretty reasonable. And then the whole third point that you develop is really just a generic argument against the idea that prostitution is really a profession that we ought to be encouraging people to engage in, because look, there's a lot of negative stuff that goes along with this, and it doesn't have anything to do with the stuff that the advocate's talking about. It just has to do with your human dignity here. What is it that you're doing? You're selling your body. People feel bad about that. They have negative self-image as a consequence. Half of them, try to kill themselves, and 20% of them, and nearly 1/5 of them, try to injure themselves in some way. A huge amount have post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're all taking drugs and alcohol as a way to compensate with this. That really doesn't sound like a very positive career path for most people, and I think that that's the way you present that argument. So this would be a good disadvantage against legalization of prostitution, but it doesn't specifically address the claims that the advocate's talking about. They're, the factual claims that they're making on this issue.
She made really great points on it, on her on her speech. So I was undermining hers by going to her strongest point.
Yeah, well, like I said, the advocate's argument was the protection of workers and customers and that sort of thing, and freedom of choice. The freedom of choice thing, I think your last argument kind of has an application to that, but you need to make that application. In other words, freedom to choose requires that you are in a situation where you have the dignity to choose, and there's some standard that's going on there.
And then safer and
Yeah.
we're good.
And well, you had an argument here that says we were supposed to get all these benefits from legalization of prostitution, and they didn't show up. There's a more generic claim about it, not just the tax thing, but you had another piece of evidence that said it doesn't really have all of these effects that they were talking about, and you need to dig that out and apply that to that first point. So, like I said, I think you've got issues that apply here, but you're not making them apply. You've kind of created your own structure, and somebody who's listening might go through the process and put it all together, but that's not the way you want to make the argument. You want to make the argument. All right.